Hi, and welcome to Venishtat. I'm Jayana, and this is the final part of a two-part series on globalism and its aesthetics throughout the 90s. Today I'm discussing 90s globalist conceptions of the future, the most popular of which is definitely Y2K. In the first part, which I highly recommend watching, I explain what globalism is and how the interconnectedness from the new tech and the sense of being at the end of history led to the emergence of various aesthetics as people looked back to the history of humanity and looked forward to a new age. During my analysis of these aesthetics, I also spoke about cultural appropriation and exchange, as well as how white supremacists appropriated neoclassical aesthetics to be racist towards everyone else around them and established themselves as superior, civilized, or modern, which is the perfect segue for this adjacent context I'm about to give. So, 90s minimalism. Minimalism was not influenced by globalism by any discernible means, save for those minimalisms that were imported predominantly from Japan and based on Buddhism as a part of the New Age movement, and how it trickled into general 90s design philosophies. L.E. Pawson of Refinery 29 mentions that in the 90s, minimalism was more prominent in high design spaces like rich people's homes, hotels, storefronts, and luxury fashion rather than interiors and wardrobes of the average person. Still, it's significant because when we think of minimalism, we harken back to the 90s since it was a response to 80s maximalism, as I mentioned at the beginning of the last part. Minimalism has come back around in fashion and design more recently, which has prompted a look at its origins. So I'm sure a lot of you by now know about Adolf Loos, a prominent modernist architect who was also associated with minimalism, who saw excess ornamentation as savagery and saw European modernism as, quote, the ultimate answer to all aesthetic problems. Naturally, because of this, anytime people give a cultural or sociological critique of minimalism, his name is involved. Now, associating any ornamentation with the other is racist, as are the loaded terms savage and degenerate, which he uses in his infamous essay, Ornamentation and Crime. In his essay, he also distinguishes art like rugs from things like buildings and furniture, which he views as needing to be firmly utilitarian. To him, any decoration of utilitarian things was a sign of cultural devolution and savagery. He abdicated for more minimalist aesthetics in order to reach a timeless look that could survive as civilization marched on. Much of the language used in his essay is eugenics speak and goes back to the notion of social degradation that was very popular in the early 20th century. This was the idea that non-white people and poor white people could spread their defectiveness and therefore needed to be kept from mixing their genes with middle to upper class Western white folks for the good of civilization. From this, we also get the concept of cultural degradation, which is basically the same thing, except that it hyper-focused on the idea that non-Western and lower-class culture could lead to, quote, lowered standards of education and failure of taste-inculcating institutions, and again, the demise of Western culture. So to further drive this point home, there was a fear among Western white society that the art, music, and aesthetics of people of color and the poor, aka the other, could lead to societal and cultural regression, and thus utterly annihilate Western civilization. And these fears were used to create laws and initiatives to both murder the said other and eradicate their cultures. Think, for instance, forced sterilization, the American Indian boarding schools, Henry Ford's anti-jazz initiatives, Tom Buchanan's speech in The Great Gatsby.
The idea is, we're Nordics. We've produced all the things that go to make civilization, art, science, things like that. Yet we're in danger of being submerged.
The Nazis' entire existence, and every US culture war spat since like the 60s. Now, none of this is to say that people are weird eugenicists for liking modernist or minimalist aesthetics. I'm just using this to highlight rhetorics of modernity. As we saw prior, anything ornate or other is of the past, while what is Western is viewed as progressive, timeless, and more utilitarian. And progressive and timeless are the key words here as I move into explaining the next set of aesthetics, which I'm calling the aesthetics of eternity, because that sounds really cool. So in the 90s, the rapidly approaching year 2000s was a big deal for obvious reasons. A new millennium was on the horizon, which only happens like once every 1,000 years. Plus, it was the end of a technologically accelerated century. The mid-1900s started with inventions like the radio, the car, and the airplane, and by the early to mid-1990s, people had gotten used to personal computers a la Apple and Microsoft, home video systems, and video game consoles like Atari and Game Boy, on top of previous inventions like photography and film, space rockets, and much, much more. With all that in mind, people were looking forward to the future, while also being slightly afraid of it, as we see with the Y2K crisis. So this excitement and fear appeared in the future-inspired aesthetics. Like the global village aesthetics, this section is split up into two: minimalist eternities and global anxieties. I use the term minimalist eternities for this first portion to bring back that idea that the less ornamentation or cultural markers there were in a design, the more timeless it would be. This is observable in the industrial and sartorial design of a lot of Y2K or the Y2K-esque, like Cyber Corporate or Gen X Soft Club. These designs, as you can see, are clean. They cannot be tied to a specific culture or time period. It's like they exist within this vacuous liminal space. With Cyber Corporate specifically, Kari co-founder Evan Collins notes that it seemed to be the go-to style to appear contemporary, especially with companies and industries associated with the booming fields of the era. And what's most striking about these images is that they were contemporary and futuristic back then, and still feel exciting and futuristic now, perhaps because of that minimalism. As you can see, this is intentionally antithetical to the globalist aesthetics, which, because of their multicultural influence, were considered to be of the past. But obviously the multicultural influence did not disappear altogether. In fact, it in some ways meshed with the futuristic aesthetics. This is especially true when it comes to East Asian culture, specifically that of Japan. So again, like I said in part 1, Western upper and middle class folks were living large in the 1980s. But Japan was also experiencing an economic upswing thanks to their export of tech and cars. And of course, anytime a non-Western country starts to have a bit of success, the West gets a bit uneasy. In 1985, Thomas White wrote in the New York Times, 45 years after the end of World War II, the Japanese are on the move again in one of history's most brilliant commercial offensives as they go about dismantling the American industry. Basically, White feared that American economic dominance would be thwarted by Japan due to how much America was importing as opposed to exporting, as well as the rise of companies like Toyota, Sony, Hitachi, Honda, and others. These imports especially spelled trouble for the American car industry, which was utterly gutted as people stopped preferring American cars. There was also fear that Japan's steady rise would uplift other Asian markets. As White states, behind Japan, the big dragon as some call it, marched the four little dragons: Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore, following in its path. And behind loomed China and India, desperate as they are to raise their standards of living, at the expense of American standards if necessary. So the invocation of dragons is unmistakably Orientalist, which brings us to Techno-Orientalism. With the rise of globalization and interconnectedness that came from it, and the aforementioned, quote, need for a new ideology to justify America's hegemonic status at the end of the Cold War, came this new breed of Orientalism that was being leveled against Japan and these other countries. The term Techno-Orientalism was first coined by David Morley and Kevin Robbins, a portmanteau of technology and Orientalism, which denotes the stereotypical lens by which the West often views the East. Unlike traditional Orientalism, which relies on stereotypes of the past, Techno-Orientalism relies on constructions of a future in which the East accomplishes supremacy through technological might, despite being non-Western and thus, quote, of the past and degenerate. As explained further, the techno of Techno-Orientalism, then, comes to signal Orientalism's relationship to economic globalization and to a form of temporal asymmetry, an Asianness characterized by the juxtaposition of cultural retrograde with technical hyper-advancement. Now, any sort of perceived cultural dominance from a place that is non-Western, as we saw previously in the section about social and cultural degradation, always gives Western countries anxiety. For Techno-Orientalism, the level of this anxiety honestly depends on where you look. Sometimes it really can't be classified as anxiety, but more of your run-of-the-mill cultural appropriation to seem hip or on-trend. On the actual anxiety side, Techno-Orientalism is most associated with the cyberpunk genre, which features both technological advancement but is often set in a dystopian world. Now, this genre obviously originated in the 80s and not the 90s like some of these other aesthetics, but it remained a prominent mainstay of the 90s and continued into the early 2000s. For more specific film and storytelling examples of this, see the Japan Takes Over the World page on TV tropes, because I'd really be here all day if I went through all of them. Elif Notes mentions multiple visual hallmarks of the genre, but in this case these visuals are all unified by being a mix of Asian aesthetics and high-tech milieus. And I don't believe this was incorporated into general industrial or architectural design, but it was present in marketing and to a certain degree music. So, What happened to all these aesthetics? Well, like any trend, they faded away thanks to a change in the outside factors that brought them into the spotlight in the first place. For one, in March 2000, the dot-com bubble burst. This leads to large online companies like Amazon losing some of their values, and causes smaller online companies to shut down, and causes a slight recession in the early 2000s. I don't want to go into business and economic jargon, so I won't go too far into this, but think of the dot-com bubble popping as the 2000s equivalent of the cryptocurrency crash we just had with the collapse of Terra Luna and FTX. This puts a damper on the whole tech innovation shtick that people had going in the 1990s. Then the attack on the World Trade Center occurs, which, on top of the mounting criticism against globalism in the 90s, thanks to the loss of industrial jobs in the US, absolutely killed the utopian globalist dream. These events burst the 90s cultural bubble and lead many to look back on the decade as frivolous and void of American values. Writing for the New York Times in November 2001, John Swartz declared that, quote, "The country is experiencing a shift away from the libertarian, individualistic values that were expressed in the celebration of the new economy, and toward more old-fashioned values in the wake of the terrorist attacks." I read this quote as a direct dig at Gen X, since the 1990s was powered by Gen X's progressive entrepreneurial spirits. We know that these individualist values didn't disappear with 9/11. After all, America was founded on such individualist values, and they would power the rampant Islamophobic sentiment in the wake of the attacks. The libertarian individualist values in question were that, as we know from the original 1990s article that defined them, Gen X were less loyal to specific corporations than they were to the idea that they could job hop and earn more money to support themselves. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Also, not that I'm some tech warrior or anything, but there's a lot of reference in Swartz's article to the leaders of the dot-com boom being geeks and whiz kids. Immature high school imagery, of course, but it also alludes to the idea that instead of these geeks winning at capitalism, it should be the well-rounded all-American kids, which, like everything in this video, is a coded concept. Throughout the 90s, there was a growing nationalist movement in response to globalism, and the people involved were blaming immigration and undocumented immigrants for lost factory jobs that were actually being outsourced to other countries. This, along with things like people of color and gay people having basic human rights, was a major factor in the 90s cultural wars, the rise in paleoconservatism, and a desire to reclaim the United States that will lead to events like Ruby Ridge and Waco, and then Oklahoma City, and then Columbine, and eventually all of the issues we still have today. After September 11th, this nationalist sentiment became more mainstream, thanks to the War on Terror. Accordingly, the multicultural and techno-futurist aesthetics of the 90s faded away. There was then a return to preppy style, which had not been popular since the 1980s, which again was a very conservative period. This time around, the prep style was embodied by stores like Aeropostale and Abercrombie & Fitch, the latter of which relied on images of thin, conventionally attractive models and all-American marketing for its desirability factor. According to Evan Collins, we do see more traditional Orientalist imagery peak in the mid-2000s and fade by the 2010s. I don't know what to make of this exactly, but judging by my previous multicultural aesthetic analysis, I would either call it some appropriative attempt at peace and anti-war sentiment, or at worst super insensitive, given that Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Southeast Asian people were being conflated with one another, hate crimes, and labeled terrorists, while their cultural aesthetics were being used for funsies. We'd also see some techno-futurist themes in Frutiger Arrow, I hope I pronounced that right, in line with tech innovations like social media and the launch of the first generation iPhone in 2007. But this seems like a nostalgic late Gen X, early millennial grasp at Y2K. So obviously Y2K is back, and has been back for years, though in its current iteration that term refers to a mix of original Y2K, McBling, and some late 2000s stuff we don't even have a name for yet. The most obvious guess for why these came back is because of the ubiquity of social media websites since they've taken over the internet, and because they've allowed for such archiving that introduced everyone to these aesthetics. Everyone was on it during the pandemic, so we're all chronically online now. Evan Collins says that for Global Village Coffeehouse, at least, it never came back and was never remembered as part of the general 90s aesthetic. I too thought global aesthetics would be dead and gone forever, since we're more culturally aware of appropriation nowadays. But someone on TikTok pointed out that now that the US is looking a little not global superpower-ish, and other countries and fashion capitals are emerging, there's a rush of multiculturalism again, at least in the luxury space, and usually helmed by people of the actual cultures which they come from. So that could be exciting. With both of these families of aesthetics, I feel like we're far more skeptical and more culturally aware. There's not an utter faith in tech or a blithe willingness to borrow from other cultures like there was in the 90s. And though people criticize Gen Z for biting from past aesthetics as they did with Gen X, I think this is just a side effect of all of these cultural materials from the past being available thanks to the internet and things like the Wayback Machine. As with Gen X, our generation's main cultural marker is that the interconnectivity and speed we have at our fingertips enables us to run through past aesthetics almost as quickly as we find out about them. That's a topic for another video. And with that, that's the end of this particular series. I realized towards the end that this was just a big excuse for me to talk about globalism, but again, understanding culture is important to understanding design aesthetics, so I hope you all learned something from this video that could help you in that respect. As always, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like and maybe even click the subscribe button below for more. My channel is still new and I'm still testing things out, so any feedback would be appreciated. I can also be found on Twitter and Tumblr. TikTok got a little annoying, so I may or may not be back there. I can't make any promises. Anyways, thanks for watching.